they're starting their student teaching experience, and it's not anything like we promised them or like they signed up for. But the fact is, none of us signed up for this. So we're all in that same collective ocean, maybe not the same boat, but we're in the same ocean. And we all have to figure these things out. And getting those young teachers to know that there really is a future here, and I'm going to be there with you. I'm not going to give up. I won't give up if you won't. We make it through this together. You got to give them hope. Lynn Jackson again says, when you're mentoring younger teachers, you have to give them your time, your information, and you give them hope. That's what you can give them those things. They're probably going to be okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Are you planning to travel with your group sometime soon? If so, please consider my sponsor, Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel, and they offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Jake Walker and Colin Peters for their contributions to the show, and especially to all of you who are listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now on to my next guest, Frank Troyka. Hi, Frank.
Hey, Mark, how are you tonight?
I'm great. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
So, Frank, I'm sure that most of my listeners recognize your name, but could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I was actually born Henry Francis Troyka Jr. My dad was Henry. I was Frank. He was my Hank. I went by Frank. So, in fact, as a little kid, I was always Frankie, but I kind of outgrew that by the time middle school came around. I was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and I ended up living in North Carolina, Illinois, and then Michigan, which is where I graduated from high school and started college. Then I moved to Texas at the tender age of 19 to finish my college education and to get connected with the Lake Highlands High School Band and the wonderful teachers that were in that cluster. I had heard some recordings of the Lake Highlands Band while I was a freshman in college, and all I could think was, I want to do that. So I moved to Texas and had some great mentors, and I've been a Texan ever since. So I'm not a native Texan, but I'm a naturalized Texan. And I live in Dallas. This is really the place I consider home.
All right, Frank. So let's talk about your origin story. How did you get into music as a child?
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of, I would always interview kids and we'd have them sign up and we'd try to match with instruments. This is not what my story was. I was in sixth grade, and I remember one day somebody came to my sixth grade homeroom class, and they said, "Hey, does anybody here want to sign up for band?" And I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun. I just raised my hand, and next thing I knew, I was in band, and I ended up being a clarinet player, which also was not a master plan. I really kind of wanted to play trumpet, but my mom was a little bit apprehensive about somebody playing an instrument that loud around the house, so I ended up playing clarinet. Little did she know that would have its own set of annoyances, but that ended up being my instrument. So that was in Lake Forest, Illinois, when I was a sixth grader. We lived just in Lake Forest is a Chicago suburb on the north side. But yeah, that's how I kind of got started, and then I ended up moving to Michigan after that when I was in high school.
You mentioned that you wanted to play the trumpet, but you ended up on the clarinet. And so what about the instrument stuck with you that kind of led to you to pursue it and to continue on?
Well, I was sort of an obedient child, and so this was my instrument, and I didn't see this as the kind of thing I was going to do for a little while and then try something else. So I just stuck with it out of a sense of, I guess, early on obligation, but as I became better at it, I started to enjoy it for its own self. Now, what's interesting is, as a sixth grader, I was not content to move along at this snail's pace. In fact, the very first day of band in sixth grade, when all the cases were lined up there, and I was so excited because there was one case there that was different shape than all the others. And I thought, I want that case. I hope that's mine. And sure enough, that was mine. And then, of course, the teacher was going to go through all the procedures. Her name was Miss Burke, by the way. She was going to go through all the procedures of how to open the case and all this. Well, I didn't. It was like Charlie Brown's teacher. All I heard was wah, wah, wah. And so I just opened the case up. Fortunately, it was the correct direction. My first experience with her was getting in trouble. But I was even more excited because my clarinet was the shiny one. It was a Bundy. It was plastic. So I was all excited about that. But, we had band only one day a week for 45 minutes. And so I'd go home and I would figure out how to play songs and do things just because I wanted to experiment with this. And I think part of that came from the encouragement I got from my grandmother. She used to manage an old 5 and dime. So long before Walmarts and Targets and Kmarts and all those things, there was the small town 5 and dime store. And at that time, I was living in New Albany, Mississippi. And of course, those 5 and dime stores had a variety of all kinds of stuff. There was a candy counter, there's a hardware section, there was clothing, toys, you name it. Everything was kind of in there. And so she brought me this little 15-key Magnus chord organ. Every key on it was numbered, and there were 6 buttons for chords, and it came with a songbook where all of the melodies, the notes had numbers over them to correspond to the keys you played. Now, I didn't read rhythms, but somehow or other, I seemed to manage to figure out pretty accurately what those rhythms were just based on the contour of the melody and that kind of thing. And my grandmother used to call it picking out tunes. When I would play something that was not in the book, just playing by ear, she called it picking out tunes. And I'm sure that's where I got that enthusiasm just transferred to clarinet. So after 4 weeks of beginning band, I was put in the 7th grade band because they mistook me for somebody who had some kind of exceptional talent or aptitude. And that wasn't the case at all. I was just an eager little kid. So I spent the next several years kind of like the kid who doesn't know how to read, but cleverly disguises that by emulation. And that's what I kind of did. So for years to come, I was reading music, but not terribly successfully. And it wasn't until I was 19 years old when I got to Texas, my clarinet teacher at the University of Texas at Arlington, her name was Carol Jessup. She identified that I was actually tonguing my lower lip instead of the reed. Mm. And so now we had to kind of start over with the embouchure and articulation, the whole thing. And I never knew that was wrong. I just worked hard enough to make my articulation sound like all the kids who were getting praise. And that worked for me for a while, but you reach a point where that doesn't work anymore. So yeah, sort of an interesting, convoluted sort of a start, I guess, in some ways.
Well, there's a couple things in there. One is you talked about how you didn't feel like you were a talented kid, but you found your passion. And do you know the educational philosopher Sir Ken Robinson? He did a couple
absolutely.
TED Talks, passed away a few years ago, but he talks about that idea, how, it's not just talent. It's a mixture of talent and passion. You have to be willing to, put the time in. I always think about John Mackey's, he likes to tell that story about how when he was a kid, he played on the Commodore 64 and wrote melodies.
Yep.
It makes sense, right? Because he found something that he was passionate about. And so I think there's, as teachers, I don't know, where we stand on the talent versus the nature versus nurture thing, but certainly there's more to it than just talent, as we all know.
Well, and I have to tell you, I'm blessed with a pretty strong work ethic, and the hard work has taken me far further than any talent or real genuine intellect. And consequently, I think sometimes I'm mistaken for someone who has those. But I think really if I have any attributes that I would claim, it would just be that I work really hard, and I rarely give up.
So you mentioned picking out tunes. I think that's a really interesting thing because it really gets sort of to that, that sound to sight method of learning, and like how the whole idea of that. And how was that helpful to you as a youngster? And I know you were learning in the Chicago area, and then you went on to teach in Texas. So there's some connections there between.
Well, I think the way that served me best is I kind of came full circle because, when you're in college, you're studying all the methodology and the sequence of things. And sometimes it can seem like the sequence and the processes and the procedures can be a little bit at odds with genuine musicianship because we get so caught up in the rules. So I think that once I finally got comfortable as a young teacher, that I started to realize, it's okay sometimes to learn by rote, and it's okay just to play songs by ear and to enjoy making music for its own sake. So that kind of freedom to do that, I think, is what I want to instill in my students now. So none of us learn to conjugate verbs or diagram sentences before we learn to speak. We all just learn through watching, copying, listening, and copying. And of course, to a great extent, that's what real musicianship is. We can go back and teach the symbology later. And that's an interesting point too, because, when you work with kids, beginners, the moment you put that book in front of them, they're distracted by all the symbols and the colors and all these things. And they stop thinking about what they sound like and what the hand position, the embouchure, the articulation, the air should be. So when we start beginners here, where I was in Richardson and teaching in the Berkner cluster and in the Lake Highlands cluster, is we didn't bust the books out for 6-8 weeks or even longer. It was all about creating a set of skills for the kids before we went into all of that.
Yeah, no, I teach fourth graders, and boy, it's you don't want to bring that book out too soon. That's for sure. And, I teach in a situation very similar. In a normal year, this is hardly a normal year, I would have my kids twice a week for about 40 minutes. And so it's not a lot of time, but they're 9. So I'm not so concerned about it. But yeah, that idea, and our whole profession is founded on the idea of rote learning. I mean, that's how we started. And, the note versus rote only became a thing later.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, no, I just think that's really interesting, that picking out the notes thing. Now, were you in a method book at that point, or can you remember?
Well, I remember having the method book, but being kind of bored with it because those weren't songs; they were just notes, and I wanted to play songs. So, and whereas that was I think a blessing, it did not serve me well because of how my efforts were interpreted. Like I said, they thought I was some gifted kid when I really wasn't. I was just playing with my new toy and having a good time.
So, what moment in your pre-college years did you know that you were going to be a professional musician? When did that dawn on you?
The actual epiphany I had would have been the second semester of my senior year. But there were some things that kind of led up to that, which I think laid the groundwork for that moment. When I moved to Michigan from Illinois, I moved at the very beginning of 10th grade. And we literally got there the day school started. Well, I hadn't been to band camp or anything like that. And I was this eager kid who wanted to be in the band. But the band director at the time said, well, you missed band camp, you're behind, let's get you in second semester. Well, I was certainly disappointed, but second semester came along and I would have had a major change in my schedule, so I didn't have band my entire 10th grade year. Now, at the football games, I would go stand at the fence and watch the band march, and I would hear them rehearsing and go stand outside the band room in the hallway. And so I was this wannabe. But then my junior year came around, we had a new band director. His name was Donald J. Horton. And he was a major force for me. He was from the University of Michigan, a clarinet and bass clarinet player. So he actually gave me some private lessons. But at the beginning of my junior year, I auditioned, and lo and behold, I was fourth chair in the program right off the bat. And that was exciting to me because I was just hoping to make it in somewhere. And so I was really motivated now. So I enjoyed my band experience. In fact, the end of my junior year, I got to march at the very first MBA, that would be Marching Bands of America, the predecessor to BOA and Music for All, the very first one in the summer of 1976, Whitewater, Wisconsin. And I'm sure that contributed to my enthusiasm as well. But I was always this sort of a kid I was way into science and math. And that sophomore year, when I wasn't in band, I really dug into those. And I thought I wanted to go into the earth sciences, meteorology, or perhaps geology. And that was what I felt my calling was. Well, fast forward now to my senior year, it's the second semester, and my band director asked me if I would be willing to conduct a small ensemble to go perform at a nursing home, because he had a conflict and wasn't going to be in town to do that. Would I want to do that? Now, I hadn't been a drum major. I had never conducted anything before, but this was a new adventure for me. So I had about 16 to 20 of my friends, and we had this book that had a bunch of songs in it, popular songs. And I remember standing out sort of in the auditorium foyer with them standing around with their stands, and I just sort of kind of waving my arms. And when I looked at the score, I think this is my math and science background up to that point. I saw it more as a schematic, seeing how it kind of lined up simultaneous events and things needed to happen at the same time. And the score was organized that way. If you look down, everything happens simultaneously. It's not like things are shifted out of alignment with one another. But then as I started to work with my peers, I'll never forget, one of them said, "Oh, you're pretty good at this." And I'm an approval junkie. So when my peers were telling me, like, "Hey, you're good at this," I started to get really fired up about it. And that's really when I had my epiphany. And I decided, I want to be a music teacher. I want to go and do this for the rest of my life. And I did.
I'm really curious about that 10th grade year. And do you still remember how you were feeling when you got into band finally? Was that like a release or a relief, or how did that play into like the grand scheme, I guess?
I'm not sure if I could call it a release or relief. I just know that it consumed me. And my mom thought that I was being brainwashed. She's like, because I spent all my time at school in the band room. And I loved that. And when I say brainwashed, she was being facetious, but there was, my parents noticed a remarkable change in how I viewed school. So that's interesting too, because my mom, seeing me as a kid who was on the path to some sort of career, a professional career in the sciences, one of the things that I think she felt, she never said this to me, but I got the sense that she's like, where did I go wrong? He wants to be a music teacher, he'll never make a living doing that. And of course that's wrong. It's just, that's the stereotype. But when she actually saw me doing some of this, she started to get it. Both my parents did. My father never asked any questions about it. My mom was a little bit more protective of all of that. Yeah.
So Frank, I want to talk about one thing you mentioned was that you went to college in Michigan, and then when you were 19, you were inspired by some recordings you heard and then transferred down to Texas. Can you talk about that early college experience?
It was a little bit atypical the way I went into college. After high school, I really didn't have the financial resources to go into college right away. So I ended up working for a year. I was a heavy machine operator. I drove a forklift. I was a welder, working for Coachman Industries in Middlebury, Indiana. This is RV factory. And that year, they say most people that take a year off before going to college, they never go back. And that could have been the case with me, because Michigan, being the automotive center of the United States, at least at the time, they had opened up a new Chrysler factory not too far from where I lived. And they were paying big bucks, like $12 or $14 an hour, which is a fortune at that time. And I saw the call of that money as being the instant resource, the gratification that I needed. But my band director, again, Mr. Horton, he was working with this little band in the town of Colon, Michigan. And yes, Colon, Colon. It was about a half hour's drive from where we lived. This band had never had any real success at all, but they asked my band director to come in and mentor them and work with them. He invited me to join him. And I'm not sure if this was a calculated thing or not, but I look back on that and I think maybe he saw this pull away from music, and he gave me this opportunity to teach with him as a way of keeping me connected to this career goal of mine. And this band ended up getting a 1 at marching contest, which you'd have thought these kids had won the lottery. the director, the whole community. It was the biggest event this little town had ever seen. And again, that kind of shared success with the students and the admiration that I got from them and the band director and my own band director was just addictive, And so I jokingly say that my first teaching experience is in the town of Colon. So when I say I started at the bottom, I know what I'm talking about.
Sorry, Frank. I spent about 2 minutes laughing at that name. Can you tell what my instrument is?
Oh my! Well,
anyway.
No, I ended up that year ended up benefiting me though, because the year off, because I actually graduated very young from high school. I was 17. I didn't turn 18 until October 30th after I graduated high school. So in a way, that kind of put me back with my age group. And the nearest big university where there was a great music education program was at Western Michigan University. And the band director there at that time just was somebody that was stirring things up quite a bit. His name was Eddie Green. And it was his last year there and my first year of college. And that's how I became familiar with the Lake Highlands Band. And I heard some of these recordings and I couldn't believe that a high school band could sound like that. Listening to them play The Rite of Spring and Capriccio Espagnol and Lincolnshire Posy and Music for Prague. I mean, these were things that weren't even on my radar screen at that age, that these kids were doing at 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. And I made some connections, and I would say it was a big courageous move on my part, but it wasn't. I really didn't have a whole lot tying me down to Michigan. These people in Texas liked what I did. They were enthusiastic about me, and they offered me the opportunity to be on their staff while I finished my degree. And it ended up being obviously a life-changing thing. I could never have orchestrated, no pun intended, I could never orchestrated anything like that to put me at that at that place at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a remarkable kind of like story. So you mentioned Eddie Green was at Western Michigan for your 1 year. And of course, his book on teaching beginners is, to me, one of the, it's the go-to as far as that goes. What sort of impact did Mr. Green have on you?
I distinctly remember sitting in his band transfixed, because his poignant use of analogy and parallel clarified things for me that I had never thought of this way before. He always had a way of taking something complex or abstract and giving you something concrete and relatable that you could use to advance. Mm-hmm. And I remember just feeling like this is something I've never experienced before. And again, I was thinking, I want to be like that. Mm-hmm. And so it was remarkably impactful. And of course, Mr. Green remained one of my idols and mentors for my whole career. And of course, his approval meant everything to me. Mm-hmm. But yeah. I will tell you though, I was not a great clarinet player in college. I had a lot to overcome. Mm-hmm. But Mr. Green still gave me a chance. He really did. I have to say that he saw past my shortcomings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's something to talk about in that a little bit down the road, but I want to ask you for an example of that, because I know exactly what you mean. I think the two best teachers I've ever had that ability to parse out the information into a way that you could use it in small chunks and then put it together. Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable talent for those who can do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a good example of something that Mr. Green would have done?
I remember one time he stood on the podium and extended his arm out in front of him with his finger pointed. And he just sang a steady note while he rotated like a beacon. And he was talking about how your sound just has to be direct and unchanging, regardless of any outside influence or distraction. You had to be singular in that intent. And I remember that really resonated with me because I'd never thought of that before, and it changed how I imagined my sound. Now, whether or not that actually transferred to something audible to the listener, I can't say. but I can say it did alter how I thought about the way I was going about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Frank, let's talk about your early career then. You're immediately post-college, your first job. Let's talk about that part of your career.
I was very lucky in that right as I graduated from college, and it took me a long time to get my undergraduate degree. I graduated high school in 77, but I didn't get my degree until 1984. But I had been with the Lake Highlands Band this whole time as a staff assistant, teaching clarinet lessons, working with the marching band. And one of the greatest benefits, the most lucky of circumstances, was that I had a car that was always breaking down. So I found myself stranded sometimes at Lake Highlands. And what would I do? I'd go watch private lessons or watch sectionals and look at these brilliant teachers in their craft. And that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't had the misfortune of a car that wouldn't work so much at the time. But right as I graduated from college, there was an opening in the assistant position at Forest Meadow Junior High, which is one of two junior highs feeding Lake Highlands High School. Well, I eased right into that, and coincidentally, I did my student teaching at Forest Meadow and at Lake Highlands, so it was sort of a no-brainer. So I slid right in seamlessly because I knew all the kids already, the staff knew me, so it really wasn't much more than just two things. One, it redefined my role, and two, it gave me an income for the first time in my life. Mm-hmm, so sure. I was on cloud nine. So I was at Forest Meadow for 4 years, still very involved with the high school because everything is about the vertical team, and that's where I kind of cut my teeth. Then I ended up at Lake Highlands High School as an assistant to Malcolm Helm. Again, one of the most powerful forces in my life. I was his assistant at the high school for 3 years before I moved to Houston.
So let's get into the Texas part of this, because as many of my listeners are not from Texas, and while we all know admire the bands in Texas, it's a little bit foreign to a lot of folks. And so can you talk to me? You mentioned something about vertical team.
Yeah.
And I think I know what you mean, but can you explain it for the listeners?
Yeah, we were very fortunate, again, that I stepped into a situation where the curriculum was aligned both vertically and horizontally. So whether it was Lake Highlands Junior High or Forest Meadow Junior High, the same methodology was happening at the same grade level. So that as the kids came to high school, they were prepared in a way that it was sort of another relatively seamless transition. I mean, anytime you change campuses, there's a little bit of a jolt. But again, one of the interesting things about Richardson to this day is that bands starting in sixth grade, the sixth graders are on elementary campuses. So if you take a look, I retired from Berkner High School in Richardson. So if you look at our situation, we have 1 high school, 2 junior highs, and 11 elementary schools where our beginners are. And so we have a large staff that travels to all of those elementary schools every day in a typical year. Certainly now it's been a little bit weird, but to teach band every day. And because each one of those elementary school bands is a little mini ensemble, it's not just a clarinet class or trumpet class, they're actually mini bands. You've got to spin plates all the time, and you've got to learn how to teach every instrument simultaneously. And so I learned so much about teaching the instruments and about pedagogy as part of that on-the-job training, because when you're trying to engage a trumpet player while you're working with a flute, you've got to be pretty clever about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that heterogeneous classrooms, I mean, that's the way I was raised, and that's what I teach now. I don't get to have, sectionals at all.
Yeah. Right.
It's a challenge. I mentioned earlier, I teach 9-year-olds, so it can particularly be a challenge at times.
Well, you can't reason with a 9-year-old. By the time they're 12, at least you can try to appeal to their sensibilities.
Yeah, a little bit.
Notice I said try.
Right. So let's talk about that then. So the idea is that because the teachers are working throughout the district, then all of the terminology and all of the teaching, the pedagogies from the same point of view, or at least the same philosophical point of view. Who oversees that? Who sets that philosophy?
Well, it's actually sort of established by each cluster. There were 4 clusters in Richardson, the Lake Highlands, the Berkner, Richardson, and J.J. Pierce High School. And each of those directors, certainly at that time, were such accomplished teachers. You had Scott Taylor at Richardson High School, Robert Floyd at Berkner, Malcolm Helm at Lake Highlands, and Tom Bennett at Pierce. These are just phenomenal teachers, and each one had a little bit different way of approaching things, but somehow all of those band programs found themselves at the same place in terms of the accomplishments of their students. So really what it comes down to is you have to settle on methods, curriculum, vocabulary, methodology that you agree with, that you tweak as needed, and then you stick with it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't modify things as you go, because we're always learning. But you just can't be errant in the way you approach this. You've got to be very sequential. And one of the things I learned early on there too was we cannot teach anything early on that isn't compatible with the highest level, which is why we would never teach quarter note equals 1, because at some point it's not going to equal 1 anymore. And so now you have to unteach. So we were very careful that everything built upon itself so you didn't have to go back and reteach unnecessarily. There's always reteaching going on, but undoing concepts can be.
But you mentioned, having that plan, that central idea. What were some of your central ideas that throughout your career that you kept with you?
Well, again, that kept with me. There are several. One I just mentioned about, whatever we teach early on has to be compatible with the end result. But I also took with me that you must focus on the individual. You teach the individual in the group setting. The moment we start teaching the band, we forsake the individual. And then we reach a point of diminishing returns and the kids become frustrated. It's like the band director a week before contest just has to go down the line and hear their kids and realizes none of them can play their music. The composite sounds reasonable, but there's no individual kid achieving on the level that the band director thinks is really happening. So, and this again goes back to those days in Richardson. Lynn Jackson, one of my great mentors, she was a profound influence on me, even way back then, when it came to just really teaching the individual. That has stayed with me forever. And when I got to Westfield High School in the spring ISD, I was there. I was Phil Geiger's assistant for 5 years. Just phenomenal 5 years of learning from him. And he was so focused on the individual to a degree that I really had never been before, that I started to see how he found the musician in every child. We just can't ever look at a kid and decide that they're not going to get it. We can't prejudge. We have to look at every kid like they have unlimited potential. Another one of my great mentors, Claire Johnson, she just turned 90 this fall. Brilliant flute teacher, but more than that, she's just a brilliant thinker. And being a brilliant flute teacher is sort of a subset of that. But she says it doesn't matter what the kids can do, how far along they are, as long as whatever they're doing it correctly. Because if they're doing it correctly, they can go to the next step. But if a kid is trying to do something they're not physically ready for, just to try to check off that box, then they're going to reach a point where that doesn't serve them. They're going to reach a point where they cannot improve because they're going about it wrong. So I'd say that's probably been the biggest lesson that I've taken with me all these years.
Yeah. So, but what you're basically saying is don't let them take any shortcuts no matter what, because it's only going to become a longer journey in the end.
Yes, absolutely. And another thing Lynn says is, we have to teach truths, not tricks. So we don't do every good boy does fine, because that's a trick. Now, it's not an evil trick, but you're circumventing the logic behind the staff. And so if you're thinking every good boy does fine, and then you get to the base level and you got to think good boys do fine always, well, there's that intermediate step of having to think, now, what was that little phrase again? It's sort of like learning a foreign language by translation. That's the wrong way to learn a foreign language. If you want to speak it, you have to be immersed in it, and you have to avoid translation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, again, I'm going to draw on my theory teaching. I mean, it's so crucial that you build up these complex ideas correctly, so that by the time you get to German 6, so that by the time you get to chromatic modulation, that those concepts are easy because they've a solid foundation. It's so crucial.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was just having this conversation today. One of the things that I would do with my students, and this is more at the high school level, is, everybody has their tuning chorales they do. Well, I took one of our chorales and I created a chorale analysis worksheet where there was a place to analyze every chord. I showed how you build chords in root position on every scale degree, what chord inversions were. I even had a piano keyboard that had a grand staff overlaid on it so that I could show where the notes on the grand staff corresponded to the keys on the piano. So basically, even if you didn't know how to read music, you could sit there because you had all the information. You could kind of cipher it out, figure it out. And I never made an assignment out of this. I never enforced it on the kids. We just sort of did it for fun. And because there was no expectation of getting an A or having to complete this at a certain time, it was just sort of a fun exercise. And the kids started to really get into it. And I know this appealed to those kids like I was, who were centered more in the math and the science areas, because this now was something more like that. There's some mathematics to this, there's certainly acoustics. And when you get into intonation now, we've got all kinds of science to explore.
Yeah, it gives the kids a spatial awareness too of where they are in the musical space, and maybe helps them hear each other in a way that's maybe a little more informed than just the director saying, listen to the tubas,
Yeah. Now, one of the really defining moments for me, and of course, there have been some really wonderful moments, but I'll remember that it was my French horn section I had at Berkner High School. Those French horns were sort of obsessed with analyzing their own music. Every time there was a cadence point, they would figure out what the chords were so they could identify who had the third, and all this, so they could get to the chord tuning before I got to it. And if it said sforzando and a kid didn't do it, there'd be some kid would go like say, dude, it says sforzando, don't let him tell us this. They did not want me to tell them anything they could figure out for themselves. And it's like, wow, that's pretty awesome.
The world's been turned upside down for band directors this year with the coronavirus pandemic. And, I think a lot of people, and myself included, have been doing some deep thinking on what it is that we do. And you mentioned something about teaching the individual. And, teaching band, it requires discipline and it requires order. How do we encourage the individual within the group dynamic?
That is really a tough one. And I wish I could say I have the magic response for this, but it takes a real team effort because, kids at home have access to different levels of technology and supervision. And sometimes you've got kids that are sharing one computer, trying to log on to multiple classes where they have siblings and that type of thing. So the challenges they're pretty extreme. So we have to learn how to think differently. And we have, in fact, again, to quote a little Berkner aphorism, we have to wrap our brains around this because there's an answer out there. We have to find it. So to give you an example, at Apollo Junior High, one of the two feeders to Berkner, head director there, Andrew Week, he's trying to engage his kids on Zoom, So he has certain guidelines, your head has to appear in the upper half of the screen. You must have your camera on, you must participate. So rather than waste time at the beginning of class reminding them of this, what he does is he has another teacher in the school, a volunteer who got a conference period at that time, who's sort of the gatekeeper. So all the kids log into Zoom, and then once they've got all that set up, they're moved into a breakout room. And that's when Andrew does the teaching. So all those kids who move into the breakout room now are actually set up and ready to go. Now, nobody is denied that opportunity to be in the breakout room, but in the kids' mind, it's sort of like a qualifying event. And it's done very with kindness, but also with a sense of expectation, because the philosophy is, I respect you enough to hold you accountable for these things. I will not let you fail. And although that mindset doesn't necessarily solve the problem, it certainly will get you much farther than if you just throw in the towel. So engaging kids online is important. You have to call them individually. You have to do things where they can all respond. Even when I'm working with college students online, I build into things where they have to respond by raising a hand, or I have a poll, a poll or a survey built in where they have to respond to something, and so that there are these little sort of markers along the way that help me keep them engaged.
Mm-hmm. Now, what lessons are we going to take into our band rooms when we're back to normal?
Oh my gosh, I think there are so many, because we have learned to adopt a new set of tools. I have some of my former students who are now private teachers. They're pursuing their professional careers in orchestras. They actually make recordings of things that kids can practice with. Lynn Jackson does this too. She has this thing. I think she called it something like practice with Miss Jackson. and she'll make a 30-minute recording video of her giving instruction. And she'll say, now stop the video now and try this. And when you're ready, turn the video back on. And then she'll do some I play, you play. So it's guided practice. So the kids don't have to think, how much time do I need to spend on this? When do I need to move on to that? It's all scripted for them. So they are getting that time in. And I just think that's something we can easily take with us after we're back in person in a more typical environment.
So Frank, we talked a lot about having a core philosophy. And one of the things that we talked about also is I mentioned that I'm back teaching beginners and I'd never taught that grade level before. And so this would have been my third year teaching beginners, but that's all blown up, of course. But one of the things that I've had made a habit of during my career is kind of writing notes at the end of every week about what happened and how I can be better. Did you ever write down your core philosophy, or did you ever put it in any sort of written way that would help you?
It's funny, I have done that, but as the years go on, I go back and read those. It's like, did I really think that way before? And not that it was wrong, but I've just evolved in my thinking. So I don't have anything I would say as a current philosophy statement right now. I certainly do have a set of values and things that I'm committed to as a teacher that are so much a part of me now that I don't really feel like I have to write those down as such,
in some ways, I find that fascinating to go back and look what I was writing when I was a young teacher, because I think it's instructive for yourself to see how you've grown.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like what I ask of my student teachers. I have them video their lessons, not so they can sit down and study them, but I'll tell them to set up an iPad or your phone in the ensemble as if it was a student facing you, maybe zoom in a little bit so you can see yourself clearly. And you're going to video the entire rehearsal, the entire class. Then you're going to get your instrument out and you're going to put that video on your stand and you're going to sit in your own class. And you're going to pick one kid in that ensemble that you're going to identify with. And every time that kid plays, you play. And when that kid doesn't, you don't. And you don't get to get up and go to the bathroom. You don't get to go and get a cup of coffee or get on your phone and check something. You've got to be in your own class. And what an eye-opener that is. Because what they discover more often than not is they want to play their instruments. And as the teacher, you're constantly delivering information. So it seems to the teacher like you're doing a lot and you're engaging kids a lot. But if you're that one kid who maybe gets to play every once in a while, well, you start to see that we have to engage our kids much more frequently than we may be doing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things to do as a band teacher. I mean, it's certainly the number one thing that, we tell young teachers, and it's certainly the number one sin that I commit when I'm on the podium.
Yeah. Well, and because it's engaging to you doesn't necessarily mean it's engaging to the listener. So in fact, I tell the young teachers I work with, well, all teachers really, especially the ones working with a non-varsity ensemble that is not the top group, is, if you teach those kids like the only time they'll ever have their instruments in their hands is when they're in front of you in class, you'll teach with a lot more urgency and efficiency, and then anything they do on their own.
You can't take a day off.
And then everything, exactly, you can't take a day off. And then anything they do on their own ends up just sort of being icing on the cake. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't expect our kids to do things on their own. Of course we should. But if you're teaching with that sort of urgency is really not the word I'm looking for, because that makes it sound like there's sort of a little panic underlying everything. But you just teach with enthusiasm and that's content rich and high participation.
So Frank, now that leads me to another question, because we talked about the idea of making sure, we're always doing things the right way. So how do you blend that sort of constant playing, rapid fire pedagogy with the idea of making sure everyone's doing the right thing? Is it just correcting them as we go? I mean, how did you approach that? How would you advise someone to approach that?
There are two approaches to that. One is we would hear the kids play for us individually. And some people will call those pass-offs or help sessions. We had pass-offs. So a friend of mine said he calls them check-ins. I thought that was brilliant. There's nothing threatening about checking in with your band director to see how things are going. So we would listen to them play, and every time there was a pass off, it would always be a little mini lesson, a mini help session. So you establish a relationship with the student where you learn exactly how they play, what their strengths and weaknesses are, so you can then help them compensate for those. And of course, you carry that into the full ensemble with you because you understand much better how those students play. Now, it's a time-intensive process, but the payoff can't be, I just don't have any other way to reach it. Now, in the group setting, I think it's a matter of playing as a group, isolating sections or individuals, playing as a group again. In fact, I was just working with a student teacher yesterday. Something he was doing really well was he would stop to work with a kid, and then rather than just go on to the next kid and then the next kid, this kid would play that everybody plays. Then we go into somebody else that everybody would play again. So there's this constant engagement. They never go more than just a couple of minutes without playing again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
So again, it's back to the whole philosophy of you have to teach the individual in the group setting.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I got the idea. It could have been in one of these interviews. It could have been from a book. Who knows? You know how knowledge is. It comes to you and you can't remember. But one of the things I do with my fourth graders is I give them a secret word. Like when they have something that they do a lot, let's say I have a trumpet player who puffs his cheeks, I have a secret word for him. And then so all I have to do is say, Walter, whatever. And then he'll know, oh, I'm puffing my cheeks. I don't even have to say, don't puff. And it kind of takes the threat out of it too.
Sure. And there's another way to approach that too, is rather than singling out the individual for something they're not doing or they're doing incorrectly, identify the people who are. Again, just on this past Monday, working with a young teacher. She's a wonderfully promising young teacher. She's a college student now. There were 3 clarinet players sitting in the front row, and I was watching them, and these were kids like in a 3rd band at a middle school. So these are not advanced players by any stretch, but they were making some good sounds. They were set up well. Their hand position looked good. And as I was looking at them, I said to her, may I make a comment for a moment? So I looked at the clarinet and said, hey guys, I'm so impressed with the energy you play. And 2 out of 3 of you have absolutely beautiful left hand position. Your fingers are over the tone holes. They're curved properly. It just looks wonderful. And of course, next thing you know, all 3 of them are doing it correctly because everybody's thinking, is it me? And so that way you don't single the kids out. But one of my mantras is praise behaviors you want repeated.
Yeah, see, that gives me anxiety sitting in that section.
Well, yeah, you kill them with kindness, you make it tough love, whatever you want to call it. But it's funny to watch how kids respond, and then you follow it with praise, and everything is okay. And they learn to anticipate that praise for having modified whatever they need to, and everybody's happy.
Yeah, that's a really, really important lesson for a band teacher, right? Is to get the students to kind of anticipate what you want so that they're looking for you. But how do you balance that with not overpraising them?
Well, I tell them that praise has to be earned. So you just stick to the facts. And I'm constantly on them to avoid saying things like good job or great or that was perfect. Praise needs to be earned. So, and it doesn't mean that you withhold it for weeks or months or whatever, but you look for something that is praiseworthy. And so that the kids learn to associate achievement with a payoff in that short term. Another strategy here that kind of ties in with that is rather than focusing on what not to do, I ask the teachers to focus more on what they want the students to do. So instead of saying, don't rush or don't let your hand collapse or don't puff your cheeks, whatever I tell you not to do still sets up that image. Whether I tell you to do it or not to do it, the mental image is the same. So if I said, hey, class, don't picture Mr. Connor wearing a Spider-Man suit. Well, I said, don't picture that, but of course, what do we see? So when we say don't, it sets up this thing, this image of all the wrong things. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't valuable. There are times when saying don't do this is far more efficient and intuitive and logical, but we shouldn't default to that. We should default more to what we want them actually to accomplish.
Yeah, no, it's like when you teach any instrument, that's how I think is, you're constantly reinforcing the fundamentals, right? You're constantly talking about your tongue with where you want the tongue to be in a clarinet. All those things, you're not singling out the kid. Yeah. And it's reflected in the way beginning band teachers talk too, right?
Sure, sure.
So, leaks cause squeaks. It doesn't single
Oh
anything
yeah.
out, but when a squeak happens, when you say that enough times, the whole section knows it and they all look at their fingers and,
Well, the instrument is designed to play correctly, and to whatever degree it doesn't is the person holding it.
Yeah, my clarinetists might disagree with you on that, but
Well, because their clarinets are not in good working condition then.
well, when you teach 9-year-olds on the clarinet, there's a host of issues that come with that. But
Well,
that's
their fingers don't cover the holes; they go in the holes. Those kids are so little.
Right. Absolutely. That's my frustration instrument, if you can't tell, because of the age level. But usually by the time they're 6th grade, we're good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're physically more suited to it, and emotionally, intellectually, their brains have developed now to where they have a greater capacity for some of those concepts that are far too abstract for an 8 or 9-year-old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and let's be honest, the clarinet, as instruments go, is acoustically more tricky at the beginning than a lot of other instruments.
It defies all the rules that every other instrument.
Oh, this is really interesting. See, Frank, I could really get into this. I'm missing teaching beginners. So in my school, we've decided early on, because of our facilities, that we were going to suspend instrumental playing for the year in October. And so now I'm teaching the kids technology. And so we do projects on Soundtrap, and I teach them, the structure of pop music, and we do podcasts and commercials, and just trying to teach them music in any way I can. But boy, I really miss the band.
Well, and I do too. I'm retired, whatever that means. The irony is I did far more teaching after I retired than I ever did when I was in the classroom, because I didn't have the administrative tasks and all those things to have to balance. I was doing far more teaching. And now that I have been experiencing the same thing every other teacher is, where I'm teaching through a screen, I crave that ensemble fix that we just don't have right now, but it's coming back. It's coming back. And I absolutely believe, and I'm not just saying this to create sort of a hallmark moment here, but I think we're going to come out of this and be way better teachers than we would have been otherwise. We're going to learn so much from it.
I think so. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's just caused so much introspection. Yeah. So, one of the things that's happening is as you watch band directors on social media, you see, especially young directors, and now I don't mean this to like cast aspersions, but maybe it's just a youthful thing, but I see a lot of people worried about their programs. Oh, I've lost so many kids. I've lost 60% or 35% of my kids. What would you say to them?
Well, why are we losing them? Well, probably because they're not having the kind of musical experience that they once had. So I don't know that I can give like a stopgap measure for something like that. I think if we are giving them some short-term opportunities for success, whatever that may be, whether it's having them play individually and creating like I said, the practice video that they can engage in and still feel like they're getting better, whether it's creating a mini virtual ensemble of just 2 or 3 players that you can kind of create a musical experience for them. Those are things that I think can help us get to that destination down the line. And of course, we have to share our vision with them, what things are going to be, what we're looking forward to when we come out of this. And this means we have to, whenever possible, engage the families, engage the parents, because I'm going to tell you, if a kid is ready to drop out of band or orchestra or whatever it is, that's not limited to that. They're thinking about dropping out of math too. They're not any more engaged there either. So this is a symptom of a much bigger problem. If we look at this like this is an issue that we all have to tackle, well, then none of us are trying to save the world by ourselves. And we have to work together and partner with this. And yes, it's going to be a pain in the short term, but it's just the short term.
Mm-hmm. I try to respond that this is just an opportunity to rebuild.
Yeah. And everybody's going to have to do that to some extent, because we've all all experienced attrition. We've all experienced, schedules now that have been constructed that in some ways are in conflict with good classroom teaching, but it's out of necessity, not out of desire. I'm with him.
Yeah, it's something I'm actually kind of looking forward to it. I didn't start fourth grade beginners this year, so next year I'm going to be starting 2 cohorts, fourth grade and fifth grade. And in a way, I have an opportunity to kind of really sort of shape everything exactly as I want in a new way.
Yeah. Mark, there's another strategy too for engaging kids. And, anytime you go off and teach someone else, you get better yourself. I mean, right? We've all experienced that.
Yeah.
Well, let's engage those older kids with the younger ones. Create mentors, people that are older. So the kid, when a kid has a proximate role model, they sort of have like a little crystal ball. They can see their own futures through the experience in the eyes of this older buddy that they're working with. So, it's all about relationships too, right? So we have to help engineer, for lack of a more delicate word, engineer those relationships. And so there's a sense of community, a sense of the future. And those older kids, when they're mentoring the younger ones, they feel an obligation to go the distance themselves because here's somebody counting on them. So it's a reciprocal thing,
That's particularly effective at the high school level.
Oh, yeah. Well, we used to have mentors at the high school that would go down to the middle schools. I'll tell a little story with you. This is when I was teaching in Houston. The top band at Cypress Falls High School, we were playing the Profanation from the Jeremiah Symphony by Bernstein, and I had you got to have decent trumpets. You got a double tongue high C sharps. You have to have 2 people that can do that. And I had a couple of I had some pretty hotshot trumpet players. So these kids were mentors to the kids down at the junior high. So they would come down once a week and just help the kids with their tryout music or their solos or their band music, whatever, just basically establishing those connections. I go down to the middle school band room one day, and what do I hear? I hear this kid playing some of the Profanation. Now, he's not playing C sharps double tongue, but he's playing the more achievable parts. So his high school buddy, the door opened and this high school buddy said, "Hey, we'll get a copy of this for you right now." And so now this kid's got the music. So now what does he do? He comes to the high school band concert to hear this music that his older buddy is playing in performance. So, again, it's relationships. It's really what it comes down to.
If you could give one lesson to the listeners, if you could say one thing, what would you say?
Regardless of how long you've been teaching, have mentors, people that have more experience, more knowledge than you do, and learn from them, and not to be afraid to reveal your ignorance. This is something that I work at particularly hard at with the young teachers I mentor and the college students, especially when I'm supervising the student teachers. I tell them I don't want to be just some other professor that you've got to tick off the boxes for. The assumption here is you're going to do a great job at student teaching. Let me help you fill in the gaps. Let's focus on what a good teacher does. And if we focus on what a good teacher does, we're going to check off the boxes automatically. So rather than try to hide what you don't know, come to me and ask me those things that you may not want to ask somebody else. I had a couple of student teachers 2 years ago, now maybe 3, who they're both saxophonists, fine saxophone players, and they were teaching beginning trombone. And I said, "So tell me, how's it going?" And they were always going, "Great. I'm having the kids are learning well. They look good. They're making good sounds." I said, "So are you comfortable with all of the positions and how they relate to the overtone series?" And there was this long, awkward pause. I said, "So if I said A flat, a top line A flat, would you know what position that is?" And there was this hesitation. And they eventually, answered correctly, but you could tell that this was really not something they had right there in the front of their brain. They had not had anybody really sit down with them and explain how this works. So they came to my home, and for 2 hours, I worked with them on the overtone series and how that relates to brass fingerings and trombone positions. And there was like this weight that was lifted from them. You could just see there was like, "Oh my gosh, I get it. I get it." And as a young teacher, I was deathly afraid of revealing to these brilliant people I was working with. I was deathly afraid of revealing to them what I didn't know because I felt like I had to be the expert. when all that time, those people weren't going to judge me. They were good. They wanted to help me. They wanted to, so that was a fear that came from, it was an irrational one that I generated myself. There was no outside force making me feel that way.
Yeah, it's hard. I say it a lot on the show because I really like this advice, but a friend of mine likes to say, don't let your ego get in the way of progress.
Right.
And that's really, really it. Because boy, there's lots of things I don't know. I was a college theory teacher. It's been a long time since I taught band when I got to my new job. And there's a lot of things that I just had forgotten or didn't know. But it's hard when you have a doctorate in music to kind of reach out and say, hey, I need help with this.
Yeah. But, there's something also very liberating about doing that, because now you're not carrying around this burden of ignorance. Maybe ignorance is a little bit strong, but I think you know what I'm saying, are you?
I always tell people, if you give me a clarinet lesson, I'll teach you all about German sixth chords.
There's a fair deal.
Not many people take me up on that one, Frank.
Well, I didn't want to say anything, but yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
Remember your first term of teaching? Learning all the skills that you don't get taught in music school? Managing a transitioning culture in your classroom? Finding out that you have to teach guitar this term? During those early years, we found out that leaning on a community of music educators was important, not only for building that knowledge in ourselves, but also maintaining enough sanity to serve the students right in front of us. Amused is a podcast centered around a community of music teachers. Between the four of us, we teach choir, band, orchestra, general, jazz, and marching band at the elementary through collegiate levels. We certainly don't have all the answers, but you're welcome to listen in while we try to find them. Join us while we work through the challenges of music teaching and celebrate the joy of bringing music making into the lives of young people. In each episode, you'll hear stories, both good and bad, about that week of teaching, and we'll try and tackle an issue that one of us is struggling with. Something we're all taught is that music brings people together, but being the only teacher in your subject at a site can be really isolating. We think everyone ought to be a part of a community, and you're welcome to come join ours. Episodes come out on Wednesdays during the school year, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at amusedcast.org.
All right, Frank, this has been a terrific conversation. We should probably get on to the final group of questions.
Okay.
I asked these of everyone, and some of them are really big, but it's just answering from your perspective. You don't have to try to solve all the problems of the world.
Okay.
And the first of these questions is, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
Competition is a way of life. I mean, we find competition in a job interview. I think to pretend that competition is something to avoid is not serving our kids well. They're going to have to compete with things. I think when you focus on the outcome rather than the process, it can be unhealthy, because if it's all outcome based and you fall short of it, what do you have to fall back on to feel like this was worth it? And I can use marching band, marching band sort of being the art of the obvious. After every performance, halftime or competition or whatever, as soon as we were done with the show and halftime was over with, I would make some announcements to the kids, give them a little rundown of how we just did. And then we would break into sections, and I'd let every section talk about what went well and what we want to do next week. We never let them dwell on problems or point fingers. It was all about taking a measure of what we just did. And when we went to competitions, we would do the same thing. I would ask them, well, what do you think? What felt good to you? What didn't? Because I want them to evaluate themselves. Now, that's not going to negate the outcome of the competition, but it will mitigate disappointment at times. Because if they come to the conclusion that, we had a great performance and the judges don't see it our way, we at least have that moment that we came together and agreed this was good. And if it's not a good performance and things don't work our way, well, then that makes sense. All is right with the world. And then on those occasions where you felt like you really could have done better, but the results work in your favor, that's pretty fun too. So I get you focus on the process. And I'm not saying this to sound falsely humble in any way, but I can think of countless band contests I've gone to. I honestly cannot remember where we placed on most of them. But I can tell you what the kids were like. I can see their faces. I can tell you about the pep talks. I can tell you about what we did on the bus and what was happening in the warm-up room and how they felt after coming off the stage. Those are vivid memories for me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. You remember how you feel. You never remember the details. I don't remember my senior year of high school. We had a terrific program that year, and probably the reason why I'm a band director. We did the first suite in E flat, Irish tune, and our march was the Alfred Mad Major.
Oh yeah,
terrific program.
Sure is.
And boy, I just had so many peak moments that year. I don't remember any of the scores we had, but I remember every concert, every competition.
Yeah, I did the first suite when I was a junior in high school. And I will never forget that. It was such I felt, remember, there was a junior, I'd had a year off from band. So playing literature like this was just like a dream come true. And I do remember going to contest. Now, I'm pretty sure we got a first division, whatever, but I remember I can still see the stage right now. I can see us going into the sighting room. And in Michigan, you went in and you didn't get to have 10 minutes. You had two pieces that you were given, generally a lyrical one and then a more technical one, and you just kind of had to read them down. But I remember all of those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tell people the reason I became a band director is my senior year of high school. I was in California. It was in a high school that was built in like the 1870s or something. It was very old. And we were in a big room that had like an old wood floor, and it was kind of dusty in there with the windows really high, almost like an old gymnasium. And I remember one day playing the Irish tune from County Derry. Band sounded terrific. I was the principal trumpet, the lead trumpet, and that high note C at the climax of that was perfect. The band sounded great. The sun was coming through. You could see the dust in the sunlight. I just remember that so vividly.
Wow.
It's like, it's remarkable what music can do.
That sounds like an amazing moment.
It is. It was. And it's one of those, I've had dozens of them since, but that's the one when I look back at the end of my life, I'm going to say that's what led me down the path I followed.
And isn't it great when those things just sneak up on you out of nowhere? If those had been planned, it would take all the charm and the romance out of it. It's just when they just walk up to you and gently tap you in the shoulder and say, "Here I am."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't go in expecting. You don't plan it. Maslow's peak experiences, what those are, that idea. Yeah. All right. Well, I went off on a tangent, so we'll get back to it.
It's the band director thing to do.
It is. So Frank, another thing band directors like to do is make jokes about being the first one in the parking lot and the last one out. How do you feel about that? And how did you find a work-life balance in your life?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask that question. I will tell you that I had to sometimes just schedule things. I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to close the day down at this time regardless. Now, I wasn't very good at keeping that promise to myself, but here's what I would do. And this is going to sound like imbalance because of some of maybe the schedule I'm about to describe to you. But in terms of my mental health and my physical well-being, it worked. I would get up very early in the morning, sometimes 4:30 or 5 in the morning. And I would, brew my coffee, make my bed, sit down, and first thing I would do is just get on the computer and go take care of emails, go get rid of some tasks that are going to clutter my day up later, get rid of some of those things. And I also do some of my best thinking in the morning. So, because, when you get to school, suddenly you're everybody's property and you're having to answer to things and meet other people's needs. So that morning time to me was sort of sacred. And that meant that when I got to school now, I'm feeling like I'm on top of things. And then at the end of the day, doing something that is going to make me feel like I've accomplished something. I like lists. So having my rehearsal plan worked out before I go home, or stopping on the way home perhaps to get a cup of coffee or maybe even a beverage with my score and go over some things. Those things made me feel like I was really accomplishing things. And so for me, again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of being the approval junkie, this was sort of rewarding myself in a way, and that worked for me. But I also like when there's time to take a vacation, it's work hard, play hard for me. I like to go skiing. I like to travel. I want to go hiking. I like adventure stuff. So I kind of create that same sort of, I won't say extreme experience because that's not it, but the activity-rich experience in my personal life, because my professional life is certainly very dense with other things. So that's how I kind of get the balance working for me.
Sure. And everyone's balance is different too. You can't look at someone else and say, "Oh, I wish I had what they have." You have to make yours.
Well, you hear people talk about burnout, and that's a word I kind of avoid for philosophical reasons, because burnout can encompass everything from mental health issues to just I don't like my boss or whatever. But I've never really experienced what I believe other people call burnout, and I think it's because I'm always around people that I value, that I learn from. I really work to surround myself with people who are better than I am, so that I feel like I have these things to aspire toward. And I know that has kept me from experiencing those things that other people call burnout. And when I left teaching, I didn't leave teaching. I moved on to a different phase of my life, which opened some doors for the people that followed me and created new opportunities for me. So like I said, I'm teaching more now than even in a COVID environment, maybe not quite as much, but certainly the composite of all of it has been far more rich with teaching than it was when I was in the public schools.
So, Frank, this is a big question, and I've had a lot of different answers for this one, but what are the challenges facing music education or the band community as we move forward into this century?
Well, if you'd asked me that a year ago, I'd had a completely different answer. But I think that the challenges we're facing right now are the same ones every teacher is facing, which is how to navigate the waters now until we can come out of this and then kind of, as you said earlier, kind of rebuild. But in a sort of a global thing, I think what we have to do, the challenge we have to meet is to continue to be relevant and to make ourselves indispensable. We must get out in the community and be woven into the fabric of the community so they can't possibly imagine what it'd be like not to have the band there. So even though it can be an imposition at times, you take your jazz band, you go to National Night Out, or you have the drumline go play for a middle school pep rally, or you put together an ensemble of kids to go play for the new yogurt shop that opens up. You go to your principal and say, hey, do we need any music, anything coming up? You go to your junior high and do that. You look for ways to weave yourself into your program, your kids, into the community. One of the things that was a real positive, and I could do this in my community, some places this wouldn't work, but at our holiday concert every December, we'd have a big sing-along. And so that everybody in the auditorium participated in some way. We would have a rehearsal before the concert so that anybody that had a band instrument, parents, community members, little kids, if you play an instrument, come up early before, and we're going to run through this, and then you're going to join us on stage at the end. And of course, we'd always have people that were not at the rehearsal but join us anyway, which was fine. So everybody in that auditorium is engaged in making music, either with your instrument on stage or by singing. And I used to frame it that, this is not about a religious event. This is not about trying to somehow cross the line into someone's ideology or faith. This is about community. We all get to share in this. And I would also, just to kind of mitigate any concern, I would say I'm so glad that we all live in a community where we can do something like this. So I guess to boil it all down, we just have to stay important and relevant to our constituents, if you want to use such a sterile word, I guess.
Frank, so I just invented a time machine, and I'm going to take you back to your high school graduation. What are you going to tell yourself?
Embrace the setbacks. Because in retrospect, everything that at the time seemed like an obstacle actually ended up being a pathway. And I'm not saying this to create this, kumbaya moment. It really is true. The gap year I had after high school set me up to be in Eddie Green's band at the right time to then connect with Lake Highlands. You could say, well, that could have happened a year earlier. I don't think so. Because there were other people involved that would not have been there, that would not have had access to a year earlier. And then dropping out of college for a semester, I don't think I told you this, but I dropped out of college for a semester to do drum corps because I marched in the Madison Scouts way back in 1980. And if you were in the snare line or the rifle line, you had to move up there in January. Well, I was in the rifle line. So I was blessed with professors at college that felt like I was going to come back a better teacher with experiences that they couldn't offer me. And so they did not withdraw my scholarship. They gave it to me when I came back. But that semester that at the time felt like I'm getting behind ended up being a catalyst to opportunities that could never have come about any other way. So And as I told you earlier, my car breaking down was a blessing, because I was constantly observing these brilliant teachers. So what I would tell myself is, and not that it would do any good, even if I could go back and do that, but embrace those setbacks and work to see beyond them, because life is going to go on, and chances are it's going to get better.
So Frank, if you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you'd want to conduct, and why?
Well, this may not be the answer that most people would give. But there's a beautiful piece entitled Sanctuary by Frank Ticheli that I love. And I love because it has the source material. He actually took the melody and created a piece called Earth Song with this beautiful text. And his setting of this for band is beautiful. And one of the reasons why I love that piece so much is because our second band at Berkner played it and did such a beautiful job with it that it remains one of the pieces I listen to this day. I listen to that recording when I just want to kind of calm down and feel good about kids making music. Now, certainly there are pieces that, O Magnum Mysterium, the Reynolds transcription of that, gorgeous. I would love to do that. And I don't mean to in any way discard the great masterworks of our genre, but we do have living composers today that are doing some pretty wonderful work. And I think we need to acknowledge that in our lifetime and not in retrospect.
Absolutely. As a composer, I'm all for that.
Well, Frank Ticheli also is near and dear to my heart because he is a graduate of Berkner High School, where I retired from. Yeah, he was in Bob Floyd's band way back when, and I think he graduated from high school in 1976. If I'm not mistaken. And he's a trumpet player in the band, and so when he comes back to Berkner to guest conduct or whatever, it's a real homecoming. And I will tell you, my first year at Berkner, I had a wonderful surprise. We were at a football game. It was halftime. We'd just finished performing, and we were back up in the stands. And anybody that knows me knows that I perspire very easily. Like, I sweat when I swim. So doing marching band in Texas, I'm just dripping wet. Well, next thing I know, I'm standing there, and there's an arm that comes around my shoulder. And I look over, and my gosh, it's Frank Ticheli. He's in town visiting his mom, who at that time lived. She's passed away now, but she lived within walking distance of Berkner High School. And he came over and just said hi and how much he loved the band. And it just really meant a lot to me that someone of his stature would take time to come and do that. So big moment.
Yeah. All right, Frank, this is a very odd question in the middle of a global pandemic, but is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Not as a specific event, but there is something I would like to tell, again, particularly young teachers, because they're our future, but to everyone in general. We must support our associations, our MEAs, our band associations, and we must show up. Even now, we must show up. I know, I remember distinctly thinking when we've had state legislators come to TMEA and do a keynote, and the Lila Cockrell Theater is packed, the entire orchestra level plus 2 balconies, packed with these rabid music teachers. Well, those legislators look out on us and they say, my gosh, these people are into this, and they represent all of these families, and these families vote. So they look at this and they see the numbers that we represent. That speaks volumes. We must be visible. We must support our state associations. We must go. And if you don't go to your state association because you've got marching band, well, if you can't miss 2 or 3 days of marching band, you're in way bigger trouble than those 3 days are going to solve. Go support your state associations, and do it in a way that it's consistent. And encourage your associates to do the same. So that would be what I would like to promote.
Absolutely. And we need to respect the people who came before us, the Philip Haydens of the world who did all this to lay the groundwork for what we have.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Frank, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I guess email would be the easiest way. I'm going to give you my Conn-Selmer email address, and that's ftroyka, FTROYKA, at conselmer.com. Now, those of you who may be familiar with Conn-Selmer will know there's a hyphen in there between Conn and Selmer in the email address. However, they've now redone that domain name, so whether you have a hyphen or not, it's still going to get to us. So that would probably be the easiest way. And of course, if you're a drum corps person, you could email me at frank@bluedevils.org if you'd rather do that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Frank, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for what you're doing for our profession. This is really a wonderful resource, Mark. Thank you.